So some of you have noticed that I haven't been doing videos every week and they're a little more sporadic. I stay pretty busy. Right now there's about 12,000 subscribers and there's only one of me. When you guys leave comments and you email me and ask me questions, I read those and I respond back as soon as I can, and I try to answer your questions with the videos. So I also have side projects that involve tattooing. One of the projects I'm doing right now involves these little hand pokers, and I'm 3D printing these and working on these. These are little prototypes that I have already. If you miss me for one weekend, don't worry, I'll be back. I'm probably working on a project. Those of you who are doing hand poking, this will give you a better way of doing it. I enjoy hand poking a lot, and I think right now there isn't a lot of equipment out there that helps people out who do hand poking. A lot of you are tying chopsticks to needles and just using needles to hand poke, and this is a better system because you can actually hook up a disposable tube and a needle to this. So right now what I'm seeing a lot of is the machine frame, where you just cut off part of the frame and you use that for hand poking, and that's not really cost effective. That's gonna be a little more money, and the way these are made, it should save you some money. They're not as expensive, and I can do some really cool stuff with it. These are just prototypes right now, little generic ones. Pretty soon I will have some really cool hand pokers with some really nice designs on them, and I can even personalize them for you guys. So if you're interested in something like that, you can always email me. So that's what's keeping me busy right now, is working on that, and that'll be done pretty soon, and those will be available. So the last video I did, I talked about spring theory, and I encourage you guys to watch that video because this video is a continuance from that video. And we talked about how the different shapes of your spring and different sizes of your spring will change how your machine runs. And today I'm going to show you how to dial that in and how to test your springs and see where they're at. So the way we test our springs is with our readout on our power supply and with this tool right here called a spring tension gauge. And you can see that we have a spring right here, and then right here, let's see if we can see that, you have some numbers, and as you push down on this, this will tell you the tension of your spring. If it's down here, you don't have a lot of tension. If it's way up here, you got way too much tension. And these are a little expensive. I'm just going to warn you up front. You know, these go for about 40 to 50 bucks, maybe even more. I think that's why some people don't want to buy a spring tension gauge, and I don't think everybody needs one. But if you're building machines and working with coil machines and adjusting machines, I would get a spring tension gauge. If you're one of those artists who just wants to tattoo and you don't want to know why your machine works the way it does, you're just going to tattoo with it, you know this one particular machine works for you, then you don't need a spring tension gauge. The only reason why you need a spring tension gauge is if you are adjusting machines, fixing machines, and trying to tune in your machines so that they work for you. But if you have somebody else doing that for you, then no, you don't need a spring tension gauge. So the way your spring tension gauge works is you put the tip of it either on your armature bar nipple or right here on top of your armature bar. And you push down on this armature bar until your armature bar touches the top of your core right here. So once your armature bar touches the top of this front core here, you look at your numbers and that tells you your spring tension gauge. The question I always get is, what about the front spring? How do you test the front spring? And the answer to that is we don't. We're not testing the tension on the front spring. The front spring mostly involves your speed, and we're not looking at that right now. Right now we are looking at the tension. So when you push down on the armature bar, if I grab this and pull down, the only thing it is pulling down on is this rear spring. As soon as the front spring leaves that contact screw, there's just air there. There's nothing there that's going to affect this tension gauge. The only thing that's going to affect the tension gauge is this rear spring, because you are pulling down on this spring. This is getting bent down this direction, and we are testing to see how much force it takes to bend this down until the armature bar touches the front core. We are not testing the front spring. This is just testing the tension on the rear spring. And why is that important? One of the reasons why you need to check your tension is because we have these nice electromagnets here that we call coils. The purpose for your coils is to pull down your armature bar. Just pull it down enough so it hits this front core. That's why we test it right there. That's as far as it goes. If this has a lot of tension, if your rear spring has a lot of tension, it's more difficult to pull this down. It is harder to pull down this armature bar. These coils, it's their job, they're electromagnets, to pull down this piece of metal right here that we call our armature bar. It's their job to pull this down so that your needle will pierce the skin. And you have a lot of layers of wire inside of these coils wrapped around these cores. And these require some voltage to work, some electricity to charge these so that it pulls down the armature bar. If you have a very small amount of tension on here, they don't have to work as hard. They don't have to work that hard to pull down the armature bar. It works really easy. So these coils take a lot of voltage to pull down the armature bar. If you put more tension on the rear spring, you have to turn up the voltage and make these work even harder. So when your coils are working correctly and your machine is tuned correctly, it doesn't require a lot of voltage to pull this armature bar down. If you pump a lot of voltage through these, your coils will heat up, almost too hot to even touch. If you have a lot of tension on here, these coils need to work really hard, and it's difficult for them, so you crank up the voltage and then these get hot, and then your machine doesn't work correctly because it's hot, so you crank up the voltage a little bit more, and then it gets even hotter, and this thing is just sputtering and slamming away because you don't have it tuned correctly. You have to crank up that voltage to get it to work, and you're really pushing this machine. The goal here is to have just the right amount of tension on your rear spring to do the job. so you can have just the right amount of voltage for your machine to work without overheating. Not enough tension and your machine will be really weak. It won't have the hit you need to puncture the skin. So you don't want to have too little, you don't want to have too much. The trick with tuning a machine is to get just the right amount. With a tension gauge, you can check that tension and judge yourself to see if that is too much or too little tension. Without it, you're just flying in the dark. You don't know what you can use feel. You have these things called fingers. You can feel how much tension it had. If you take your tattoo machine and pull down on this armature bar. If that armature bar is really difficult to pull down, you have a lot of tension on that. If it's really easy, you might not have enough. But if you're not an experienced artist who can do this by feel, then you need a spring tension gauge. I did not understand a lot of the tension issues with my machines until I got one of these. And you probably won't understand what I'm talking about until you get one of these and see for yourself how adjusting the tension on your spring will adjust how your machine works. It's not a little thing, it's a big thing, because my tattooing improved 110% once I realized that the tension on my machine and changing it would change the way I tattoo. So once I realized how to adjust the tension on my machines, everything, it's like the sun came out and I could see. It was like a blind person being able to see. I was able to do a lot more with my machines, knowing the tension on the machines and how they're running. The argument I hear all the time is that you don't need this spring tension gauge. And it's not really that much of a thrill, you think, oh, it doesn't do that much. So people think that they don't need them. And I'm going to tell you, when I was learning how to adjust machines, you don't quite understand everything until you get a spring tension gauge and start measuring the tension on your machines. It makes your life easier. And you can get more precise with your measurements and your tension. So I would highly recommend that you get a spring tension gauge, especially if you're going to be tuning a lot of machines. If you only need 2 or 3 machines tuned, then just take them to somebody who knows how to tune them and pay them to do it for you. But if you want to learn how to do it yourself, I highly recommend you get a spring tension gauge. So if I go through here and measure the tension on these machines, this is a liner slash shader, and I got about 350 on this machine. I like to go from the top of the armature bar, just because it's flatter and this is flat, so it just kind of makes sense to go there. But if you want to go from the armature bar nipple, you can also do that. So what we're doing is just pushing down on the armature bar until it touches the top of that front core. And we're about 350 to 340 on this one, which is a liner. This one also about 350 to 400. You can see that most of my liners run about 350 to 400. That's what works for me, so that's how I set those up. Now, this is a shader, and this one has a little higher tension because the machines that I actually use for just shading, I put a higher tension on them. This one's about 400, and then this is my color packer, which has less tension, is 300 to 400. So you can see a lot of my machines are kind of in the same range. These two machines have really great coils on them. The rest of these machines do not. So I don't run a lot of tension on these, because if you do, they will burn up. But it works out, especially with these cheaper machines, because they make great liners. You don't need a lot of tension, so you don't need a lot of throw. You can easily set these up as liners. I feel that the more you stress the machine out, the quicker it's going to fail, and the quicker it's going to heat up. When I tune a machine, I try to tune it so everything's at a minimum, so that it doesn't have to work very hard. The throw is exactly how far it needs to be. You don't need to use a lot of voltage. You don't have a lot of tension. That way, the machine works, and it is easy for the machine to work. Because the springs are not bent at a crazy angle, they don't break. There's not as much stress on these machines because everything is just to the minimum number that will work and the minimum angle. You start going to extremes, you start breaking springs, your machines won't last as long. So the spring tension gauge helps me to achieve the minimum amount of tension that I need, but the machine will still run properly. With a coil machine, this is necessary. Because coil machines don't have give clips. Give clips allow you to adjust your tension during a tattoo on a rotary machine. You can adjust it. On a coil machine, you do not want to unscrew this and adjust this during a tattoo. You set it up and you leave it alone, and you run this for about 20 years until it finally dies, or it just keeps running. But you never want to adjust this once it's adjusted. This machine is set up for shading, and hopefully it'll run for 20 plus years, maybe more, without even tuning this thing. The only tuning you want to do is maybe adjusting your contact screw a little bit. You don't make adjustments on the fly with these. They have to be set up correctly. And that's different from a rotary that you can make adjustments while you are tattooing. Because you can't adjust your coil machines on the go, they have to be set up to do what you want them to do. And tension plays a big role in that. So here we are back to the springs and tuning machines, adjusting the springs. You need to be willing to just take apart your machine and adjust it. And you need to be at that point where you know enough to do this, and you're not worried about putting it back together correctly. If someone has given you a machine and you need to make an adjustment on that, you could always check the tension and the springs before you take it apart, and then you can put it back exactly how it was before you took it apart. But if you don't know how much tension is on that, you don't know how to set up the springs again. And you have to send it to somebody to get it fixed. The spring tension gauge, you can use whatever numbers work for you. But how do you know what those numbers are if you don't have a tension gauge? And how do you replicate those numbers when you put a machine back together? So right now, this machine has 450 grams of tension. And let's see what our numbers are. This is where you increase and decrease the tension. Swing this out to the side. Make sure you're going to bend it in the correct position. Don't bend it here because that's going to bend it weird. Put it out here so it's flat and then give it a little bend. We don't want to go up, we want to go down. We want to decrease our tension. So we pull it down. If we wanted to increase, we would go up. But we want to decrease it, so we go down. And then we push it back into place and tighten everything up again. Okay, so this time we went too far. We went 44% duty. And we wanted 50, so we went with too much downward pressure. We need to give it a little more upward pressure. This is why you don't want to tweak it really hard at first. You just want to do little increments. So we bend it a little bit each time and then put it back and see where our adjustments are. See where our numbers are after we make our adjustments. So now we're back at 55. So by adjusting our downward or upward tension on the rear spring, our duty cycle will go down or up. Now another way to adjust that is to make your contact screw go down or up. How do we know what we want to use? We have the general idea that this one's going to have more tension, this one's going to have less. So right off the bat, what are we going to use our machine for? Liner or a shader? If I was going towards a shader, I would go with the fatter spring. Liner, I would go with a lighter spring or a color packer if I wanted less tension. But we don't know until we set up our machine and see what our numbers are at. So we have a general idea of where these springs are going to get us. We know if we use low tension and a fat front spring, we are going to get a liner, most likely. We know if we use a lot of tension and a little bit more throw, we are going to get a shader, most likely. And we know that if we want to use less tension, have a really long throw, we will get a color packer. So we use our knowledge of tattoo machines and how springs work to get in the general area. We're just getting in the ballpark with this. And once we're in the general area, we adjust and we use our numbers to adjust. On our readout here, we have our duty, cycles per second, and voltage. We use that to help tune our machine. And a lot of you guys are having difficulty understanding what I'm talking about or just getting what I'm talking about in general because you either don't have the spring tension gauge or you don't have the power supply with the readout on it. And these things improved how quickly I can tune a tattoo machine. With these things, it takes me no time at all to tune a machine now. Without these things, you're taking a shot in the dark. You don't know, you're really just guessing at things. So I would recommend that you get these things because they will help you out tremendously. You guys really should watch the video that I did on making your own springs, front spring and rear spring. And you should also watch the video I've already done on tattoo machine tuning, because you can't learn everything in one video. You really should watch a lot of the videos I make just because they all lead up to something. They all lead up to the final result. I can't explain everything in one video. This is how you learn tattooing. You watch something or you learn something, you pick up something, you learn one thing and you get it, but you still don't understand everything as a whole. So you watch something again, you watch another video, you learn another thing. Eventually all of this makes sense. So if you're watching this video and you haven't watched the other videos I did on tattoo machine tuning and spring theory, you have to watch everything so that you can understand. So let's see where we're going to start off here, where our numbers are at. So when we're tuning a machine, we look at our numbers and we see where they're at. And we can use this to know how our machine's going to work. So without even seeing what machine I have, I can look at my numbers here and tell you what it is. "90 cycles per second is pretty slow. And I know that I run my color packers slower. So already from the numbers, I can tell that this is a color packer. After we've checked everything is lined up and placed correctly on the machine and works, we check our numbers. When our numbers are correct, we check our tension. When our tension is also correct and where we want it, our machine is tuned. I was going to put these on a machine, but all of my machines are already tuned to where I want them. So what I'm going to do is find a tattoo machine that someone needs fixed, or just a frame somewhere, and put a machine together for you guys, start to finish, and show you how I adjust these.